In today's video, we're going to wrap up the end of Chapter 2. So previously, we had talked about elicited behaviors and habituation, and now we're going to move on and talk a little bit more in depth about sensitization. Now, we already briefly mentioned sensitization when we were talking about babies, looking at checkerboard patterns of varying complexity. So as a refresher, that's up on the screen here. So we have our simple stimulus and our more complex stimulus. And initially, the first time they see either of these stimuli, they're going to look at them for about the same amount of time. For the simple stimulus, their looking time, so how long they fixate on that particular stimulus, goes down right off the bat for the simple stimulus, but our more complex stimulus showed this weird little increase in fixation where they stared at that more complex pattern for just a little bit longer for the first couple of trials. And so this increase here in fixation, so that increase in the behavior that we're looking at, would be called a sensitization effect. Now, when we initially mentioned this as a sensitization effect, we didn't really give it an official definition. So we're going to do that here, or we can say that a sensitization effect is an increase in the vigor of the elicited behavior that results from either repeated presentations of the eliciting stimulus or exposure to a strong extraneous stimulus. Lots of S's today. So what this is telling us is that we can see an increase in the behavior that we're looking at that's specifically being caused by either having that eliciting stimulus being presented multiple times or from that stimulus being extra strong. So in this case, we have a very complex stimulus and it's being presented multiple times. So it's a little bit of both. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what sensitization is and how it works, and some examples of it as well. So the first thing we want to note is that sensitization tends to occur when you are already aroused in some way. And for behavioral research, when we talk about arousal, it isn't necessarily exclusive to sexual arousal. This can be emotional arousal. This can be physiological arousal. All this means is that you are in some way activated or stimulated. So it's like your nervous system is already primed, and so we see more sensitization when we already have that kind of priming in our nervous system. Now this example that's on the screen here, I've used this same example in 104 classes to explain sensitization, so this might be familiar to you. But here we have our startle magnitude on our y-axis, and then the x-axis is just blocks of 10 tones, so that's going to be effectively time. And so what we're looking at are rats' responses to a very loud sound being played. And so a higher startle response means that they are having a more aggressive reaction to that sound being played. Lower means less of a reaction. So in a sort of normal situation where the background noise is only about 60 decibels, so 60 decibels isn't overly loud. It would be kind of like where I'm sitting right now. I can hear my computer fan. There's a little bit of an electronic hum, but nothing too intense. And so in this situation, the first time that the loud tone sounds, the rat jumps, has that startle response. It's around 30. Our units don't really matter here. It's just that that's a fairly high number. And then after that, when it's presented again and again and again, we see that that responding goes down quite a bit. So we would say that this is habituation because that responding to that particular stimulus has decreased. But if we have the exact same animals in a similar environment except we change one thing, and this is the level of background noise, if we raise that background noise up to 80 decibels, in this situation with the higher levels of background noise, we could assume that the animals are a little bit more on edge, because most prey species are going to rely on auditory cues and other things from their surroundings to pick up on incoming predators. So a louder environment makes it harder to pick up on a predator. At least that's my thought behind it. But in this case, we see that They may have habituated to that particular tone, but when the background noise is louder, instead of staying at sort of low levels of responding here, their startle magnitude will actually increase. So in this case, what we're seeing is sensitization. We're seeing that increase in responding to our tone because of that existing sort of arousal state. This is the same as if you're sitting on a couch in your living room and you're watching a show that you enjoy and your doorbell rings, you might not jump. It might just be that the doorbell rings. You get up and answer the door. However, if it's nighttime and you're watching a scary movie and your doorbell rings, you might jump quite a bit. So there's a difference in your responding because of that pre-existing arousal. So you're responding to the same stimulus, the same doorbell, in very different ways based on other factors that are involved. So here we're going to start talking about why we even have this idea of habituation and sensitization. What's the use of these two processes? And so habituation and sensitization are kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're both different ways of responding to the same stimuli. And the basic idea here is that there is an adaptive advantage to both sensitization and habituation. So the idea is that our environment is full of different stimuli, and some of them are important and some of them aren't. So how do we decide which ones we respond to and which ones we ignore? In the wild, in most environments, you're not really going to be concerned about stimuli that are always there. If you live in a neighborhood that has a whole bunch of woodpeckers, and woodpeckers aren't a predator to you, then the sound of woodpeckers pecking on trees isn't supposed to be something that you pay a lot of attention to. It's not a threat, it's just background noise. So it would be adaptively useful to habituate to that sound because it doesn't tell you any good information. It doesn't tell you anything useful. Same as if you live on the edge of a babbling brook and there's constantly water sounds. You know where the brook is. You don't need that sound to help you find water. That sound is always there. So instead of wasting energy attending to and responding to a sound that's always there, it would be better to habituate to it to save the energy and ignore that particular stimulus. And then on the other side, if there's a new sound, something that's come in that's different, maybe you don't live near running water, but all of a sudden you hear running water. Maybe that means that there's a flood or something is happening that you should be paying attention to. So it would make sense to be sensitized to something that's new or different, something that is worth paying attention to. So in that case, it is adaptively useful to sensitize to new sounds, to intense sounds, or to things that have some kind of biological relevance to you. So that's kind of why we think that both habituation and sensitization could have evolved. It's that adaptive significance. Now, we can make use of some of these principles. We can sort of, I guess, co-opt the existence of habituation and sensitization to our own advantage. So here we have a reminder of another experiment that we had just previously talked about. So we have this situation where we were looking at salivation and taste ratings in people who were given either lemon juice or lime juice. And so the idea here is that if you're given one of those juices consistently, your salivatory response to it is going to decrease over time, and your rating of sort of how bitter and harsh it is will also go down over time. So things will become more bland over time. But if we then change it up, so if we go from lemon juice here to lime juice after you've habituated, we see this increase in responding and an increase in rating here. So we could say that changing it up by having something new, introducing something that you haven't habituated to, can make you sort of respond to it more aware of it, but also maybe increase your enjoyment, depending on whether we're looking at something that's bitter and we don't like it, or if it's something that's sweet and maybe we do like it. So it's just a vague application of this, if we want to increase our enjoyment of eating, maybe we want to mix it up. You don't want to have the same meal every day. You don't always want to have chicken and rice. Maybe you're going to mix it up, and some days you'll have tofu and rice. Maybe you'll have something in potatoes. Whatever. By mixing it up, you can increase your enjoyment of eating. If you're trying to eat less, maybe you want to go on a diet or something like that, as is your own choice. Maybe you want to decrease your enjoyment of eating. And maybe if you eat the same boring food over and over again, you'll eat less because it isn't exciting, you don't enjoy it. So you could habituate to a particular flavor and then eat less because you don't enjoy it as much. Just some possible applications here, but there are tons of ways you can apply and take advantage of either habituation or sensitization. Now, if we want a real scientific example of the adaptiveness of habituation, let's look at a real study, an actual scientific study that actually did this. So in 2002, Deek and colleagues published a paper where they were looking at habituation to predator vocalizations in harbor seals. And so for the background on this, we don't need to know tons about harbor seals, but it does help to know that seals tend to have predators that would be things like mammal-eating killer whales. So that would be something that they might want to pay attention to. And so for this study, they basically did a behavioral study where they went out into the wild and they played different kinds of vocalizations to harbor seals and monitored how many seals were visible. So the idea being that if they're expecting predators, maybe they would leave the area, go somewhere safe. So we'd see a change in how many harbor seals we would see. So for this experiment, the first part of the experiment was just to see if their principle worked. If they played vocalizations of mammal-eating whales that the seals were familiar with, so if they played the sounds of, say, killer whales, what would happen to the seal population? And the seals would seek shelter. So part 2 is, okay, if they react in that way to known predators, how do they react to other species? And so our 2 other types of vocalizations they played were either familiar fish-eating whales. So familiar just meaning that they're not new, they're something that they've heard before. Fish-eating meaning that they're not eating mammals like seals. So these are non-threatening whales. So they would make a good background noise that you might be able to ignore safely. And then the cool part they looked at is unfamiliar fish-eating whales. So these are species that they aren't used to, but that are also not threatening. They're also fish eaters, they're not going to be predators, but because they're unfamiliar, the seals may not know that. And as just a quick moment here, we can look at what the spectrograms look like for each of these types of vocalizations. This isn't essential for you to know what these look like. It's just more of me pointing out that there isn't anything overly different between these different kinds of vocalizations. There isn't anything that says only unthreatening whales make this particular kind of sound. Because if you look up here, even though there's a little bit more noise in this particular spectrogram, we still see these kinds of bands. It looks kind of the same as this. So having stared at a lot of spectrograms in my time, I can look at this and say, yeah, this is very similar to this, and this is fairly similar to this. So there isn't really anything between these 3 types of vocalizations that would tell us that the seals are responding specifically to an aspect of the vocalization, like an acoustic feature. There isn't really anything there that's distinct between each of the groups, if that makes sense. And of course, the researchers did sort of statistical analyses to make sure there isn't anything weird going on here. But it's always good to point out stuff that they controlled for, or at least looked at, to make sure it isn't influencing the results that we're seeing. And so here we can look at the results. And so on this graph, even though it's a little bit fuzzy looking, it's not the clearest of images, we have a percentage change. Basically, how did their behavior change? So scoring low here means that the seals left. They went elsewhere, they hid and sheltered. A change of 0 means no change from baseline, and if we had seen a positive, we would have seen more seals showing up. And we have along the bottom our familiar mammal eaters, our familiar fish eaters, and then the unfamiliar fish eaters. So a threatening group that's familiar, an unthreatening group that's familiar, and then a new group that isn't threatening, but they might not know that. And so our first two bars, we're going to focus on these two first because they kind of make sense based on what we would expect. So our familiar fish eaters, familiar mammal eaters is the first column. It's a threat. They're going to leave from a threat. Makes sense. So we see that decrease in number of visible harbor seals. Cool. For our familiar fish eaters, they're non-threatening and the seals are used to them. So there's no change in behavior. Also kind of as you'd expect. But where we get this cool responding is in the unfamiliar fish eaters. Now, we can see the results right here, but if we wanted to think about what they could have done, because they're fish eaters, because they're non-threats, we might have expected to see basically no change in responding, because they're not a threat. But instead, we see a responding very, very similar to these threats that are familiar to them. So it's almost like they're treating these unfamiliar whales as a threat, even though they don't actually eat seals. And so the idea here is, well, maybe it's because it's unfamiliar, they're treating it as a threat because it's better safe than sorry. So this is kind of like sensitization, where it's something new, they don't know what it is, and so they respond to it in a much more extreme way than they could have. Whereas for things that they've become familiar with, maybe they've habituated to these familiar fish eaters, they know these guys are around, they're non-threatening, so they don't respond anymore. So they've habituated to the one that's familiar, and they're showing this increased response to the one that's new. Our second graph here is just looking at the distance to that source, the sound source. So they tend to stay further away from the threatening things, the things that they know are a threat. And then there's kind of a neutral, because the error bars here cover 0. So there's really no difference between how close they are to the familiar fish eaters and the unfamiliar fish eaters. So they haven't yet learned to stay away from these new sounds, but it's kind of another aspect of the study. We're more focusing on this side here. Okay, so we've done the habituation and sensitization thing, but this is also a very good time to pause and take a moment to decide what isn't habituation. So we talked about what habituation is. We talked about the partner behavior, which is sensitization, but what else is there that might be sort of misinterpreted as habituation, but isn't? Now, the first of these you might remember from back in 104. So you might recall that sensory adaptation is not the same as habituation. So habituation is that reduction in the behavioral response to a particular stimulus as it's repeated. Sensory adaptation is going to be called a reduction in the sensitivity of the sense organs caused by repeated or excessive stimulation. Basically, sensory adaptation is like the Febreze commercials, where you go nose blind to a particular stimulus because you've been around it for so long you don't notice it anymore. So sensory adaptation focuses on what you are perceiving, whereas habituation focuses on the behavioral response. So they're very closely related to one another, but sensory adaptation is a different process and has a different focus than habituation. We might also have an issue distinguishing between fatigue and habituation. So fatigue would be a decrease in behavior due to repeated or excessive use of a particular muscle or muscles. So we're still seeing a decrease in behavior, and it's because of a repeated something, but in this case, fatigue just comes from having that response multiple times. Now this one's kind of hard to pick apart. Say you're looking at the rat who has a startle response, and they've been startled multiple times and they're having a reduced responding to the thing that's startling them. Is it because they've habituated and aren't responding to that particular stimulus? Or is it because of fatigue? Is it because they've had a lot of startle responses and the muscles involved in that process are tired and not responding as intensely? So you can pick that apart by using our knowledge of what habituation is. So we've already said that habituation tends to happen to a specific stimulus, and it does tend to tie to a corresponding response. So if you've been playing a 100 hertz tone to the rat at a particular volume and they have this startle response, and then we see a reduced responding, and you want to tell if that's because of habituation or fatigue, maybe you switch it up. Instead of a tone, maybe this time you use a buzzer or a bell sound, or maybe a bright light that happens suddenly. By using a different stimulus, we can tell if what we originally saw is habituation or fatigue, because if it's fatigue, a new stimulus is still not going to produce a massive startle response because the muscles are tired and they're just incapable of being startled. But if it was habituation, then this new stimulus is something they haven't yet habituated to. So if it was habituation and a new stimulus is introduced, then you should see a full startle response to that new stimulus. So you can kind of pick apart which one is going on in the background by sort of testing in different ways. So we make use of our knowledge here. So this diagram here is a really good way to show us the difference between our three possibilities that we're looking at. So within our sense organs, that's where we're going to see sensory adaptation. So if you're listening to music really, really loud, your hearing will eventually get used to that particular loudness. So if you had your headphones cranked up to a volume of 10, then you would get used to that particular volume. And maybe when you take your headphones off later, you find it hard to hear other things because your ears have gotten used to that particular volume. You've adapted to that particular level of sensation. If we go into our central nervous system, that's where we see habituation and sensitization occurring. And we'll talk about the mechanisms involved in that in just a couple of slides. But that's something that's going on internally at either the level of your brain or your spinal cord. That's where that's happening. And then if we want to see where fatigue is happening, that's going to be at the muscles. So in our reflex arc, or even our enacting of intentional motion, but I guess reflex is easiest here. We see that pathway from a sensory organ through our sensory neurons into the central nervous system, through the motor neurons and into the muscles in that particular direction. And each of those areas can be tied to a different thing that might be misidentified as habituation. But yeah, this I find helps me pick apart where each of these is occurring. Classical or Pavlovian conditioning is another thing that isn't habituation, but might on the surface look a little bit like habituation in certain cases. So we're going to spend a lot more time on classical conditioning next chapter, I believe, but we'll talk about it very, very briefly here. But classical conditioning is an associative change from no response to some kind of response. So by making associations between two different stimuli, we have our originally neutral stimulus that we would pair with an unconditioned stimulus. So pairing a tone with food, we can then have that tone that used to not cause any kind of reaction to eventually cause the same reaction that the food causes just because of an association between that tone and the food. So our neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and our conditioned stimulus will eventually elicit the conditioned response, which is the same as the unconditioned response that happened whenever that unconditioned stimulus was presented. So for the classical conditioning example of Pavlov and his dogs, you have your bell and your food. The bell is an originally neutral stimulus. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. Our unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response of salivating. When you give dogs food, they're going to salivate. You don't have to teach them to do that. They're just going to do it naturally. And then if you associate that neutral stimulus of a bell with the unconditioned stimulus of food, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus and will come to elicit the same salivatory response as the food does on its own. Now, on the surface, if we just look at the fact that classical conditioning involves a change in behavior after repeated exposure to those paired stimuli, it kind of sounds a little bit like either habituation or sensitization. But the distinction here is that association part. So classical conditioning is what we call event-event learning. So there are two stimuli that get associated with one another. Whereas habituation is a non-associative change in reflexive responding. It's event-alone learning. So habituation doesn't involve pairing stimuli. It doesn't involve forming an association between those stimuli. Habituation is learning about a single stimulus or a single event in isolation. So an event alone. So if you're trying to tell the difference between is this classical conditioning or is it habituation, you want to see if anything else is being associated. That's a really good shortcut to figure that one out. Now, habituation isn't something that happens sort of once and then always stays at that level. In fact, habituation and the responding that you had previously experienced should return to baseline over time. So we have our example of a rat who has habituated to a particularly loud sound in this box. So they habituate to it, they stop responding to that particular sound. But if we have a little bit of a delay, if we put them back into their home cage for the night and bring them back the next morning, we see a phenomenon called spontaneous recovery. This is effectively the loss of habituation after some intervening time. So if there's a delay, if you stop with the exposure to that stimulus, they're going to lose some of that habituation. They'll lose some of that learning. So the next day, putting the rat back in the same box and playing the same loud noise, you can see an increase in their startle response. It may not be as high as their original startle response was the first time you played the loud noise for them on the very first day, but you will still see an increase in that startle response that's going to be higher than whatever level they had habituated at. If you aren't continuously exposing them to the eliciting stimulus, then over time, their behavior will return to that baseline level. So if you had habituated this rat to that particular loud sound, and then you left them alone for a week, and then you tested them with the sound just once, their behavior would go back to pretty close to normal. And the longer you wait, the closer to normal it would go back to being. We do see a difference between long-term and short-term habituation. There are ways that you can make habituation stick a little bit longer. So if you have repeated sessions where we habituate them to a particular stimulus, so if every day you bring the rat into the same box and play the loud sound, say 10 times every single day for a month, you could have a more long-term persistence of that habituation. But if they're only exposed to it one day and they habituate one time, that would be a little bit more short-term habituation. And the behavior wouldn't, or the change in behavior wouldn't stick around. It wouldn't persist for quite as long. And there's a video to go with this. This is up on eClass as well. We might also see dishabituation. So the same startle response in rat's example, a new video, but this time focusing on dishabituation, which is basically when they start responding to old stimuli that they had previously been habituated to as if they were new. Now, for dishabituation, we actually need two eliciting stimuli. So our first eliciting stimulus is going to be the one that you habituate to, you get used to it, and you slowly stop responding to. At that point, if you're introduced to the second stimulus, then you would have a really high response because, like we said earlier, habituation is stimulus specific. So with the rat that got used to a tone, maybe this time you play a buzzer or have that bright light. So that new stimulus, that second stimulus, would have the same intensity of responding as you did the first time to the first stimulus. So the same level of startle response. That's not new or exciting from what we've talked about already. But what is cool is if you then switch back to the original stimulus, if you go back to that tone, you'll actually find this increase in responding again. The textbook calls it a rapid decay of habituation after the presentation of a novel stimulus, which basically means that after that new stimulus, after the novel stimulus, our buzzer sounds, it's like it resets that original behavior. So the habituation goes away and we go back to normal levels of responding. Another cool example of this would be if you're playing peekaboo with a baby. And so you cover their eyes and you uncover their eyes and they see your face and they laugh and they squeal because it's exciting. And you do it again and they laugh a little bit, maybe a little bit less. And over time, they stop responding because every time you uncover their eyes, it's your face. But maybe once, instead of uncovering their eyes for them to see your face, maybe you have a mask on. And that mask is new and exciting, and it makes them laugh and squeal just like they did the first time. So that novel stimulus has caused that resurgence in the behavior. And then if you go back to normal peekaboo where it's just your face, they would still be interested and excited after the presentation of that novel stimulus. So that's dishabituation. And again, another video that you can watch going over that as well. Now, all of that information about habituation and sensitization shouldn't be all that different from what you've heard in previous classes. But this is where we're going to start getting into some of the mechanisms behind that idea of habituation and sensitization. So what we've talked about so far have been what we would call habituation and sensitization effects. And these are the changes in outwards behavior that we're observing. But as much as we've talked about the fact that these outward effects occur, we haven't really talked about what's responsible for those changes, what's actually driving those effects. So now we're going to look at the underlying neural processes. So what are the mechanisms that drive habituation and sensitization effects? So we're going to talk about two processes, the habituation process and the sensitization process. Now, these were proposed back in the 1970s by Groves and Thompson. And honestly, the definitions of the processes aren't actually that complicated. So the habituation process is a neural process that produces a decrease in responsiveness. And sensitization process is the neural process that produces an increase in responsiveness. Now, where this starts to get a little bit conceptually complicated is you have to understand that the habituation process doesn't only lead to habituation, and the sensitization process doesn't only lead to sensitization as an effect. Instead, what we tend to see in nature is that the habituation and sensitization processes often tend to co-occur. So in any given situation, we might have some habituation process and some sensitization process. And whether we see either a habituation or sensitization effect is based on which of these two processes is stronger. So you can still have a sensitization process ongoing, even if we're seeing habituation overall. So the processes are going to add together to produce an overall effect, but the processes don't directly lead to the effect, if that makes a little bit of sense there. And we're going to walk through some examples, so hopefully it should get clearer as we go on. So this diagram is from our textbook, and so we can look at all of these are going to have basically a change in response magnitude. So 0 means no change, plus means there's an increase in responding, and negative means there's a decrease in responding. And then this axis is almost always time in some way. So here it's trials. And so A is going to be showing us a net habituation. So this would be a habituation effect because we're seeing overall a net decrease in behavior. However, this net decrease is actually driven by a little bit of sensitization process up top here and a lot of habituation process down here. And if we add them together, lots of decrease and only a little bit of increase leads to a lesser magnitude decrease. So if we add these both together, we get this net responding line, which is going to be basically considering both together. And we can look at a similar example, but in the opposite direction, where we have a net positive, a net increase in responding. So we would say that we have a sensitization effect here, and that sensitization effect has come from a weaker habituation process and a stronger sensitization process that add together and work out to have a net positive or a net increase in responding. All right, so let's look at that in some real data. So this experiment was looking at hind limb flexation in cats. So the basic setup here is that they would apply a very mild static electric shock to a cat's paw, and they would see how the responding would change based on how much of a shock it was. So if we look at box A is low shock intensity, and we have our S for our hypothetical sensitization process as that dotted line across the top, our H at the bottom as our hypothetical habituation process, and then the dots connected by a solid line are the actual observed behaviors. And so in A, with very low level shocks, the cats very, very quickly stop responding to them, and we see a net habituation. As the intensity of shocks is increased, they would see a more of this sensitization process and a little bit less of this habituation process, and it leads to a net sensitization over time. So A through B through C through D would be an increase in intensity. And the cool part here to notice is that our habituation process between B, C, and D is actually pretty much identical. And so this is telling us that at a certain point, the habituation process, it's always going to be about the same amount. What's changing here, what's driving the change in the observed behavior is actually a difference in that sensitization process curve, where that sensitization process gets larger and larger as the magnitude of the shock increases. And as that goes up, that's going to drive up our observed behavioral response because our habituation process really isn't changing all that much. So that's how we would interpret this data here. And that's the difference between a habituation effect and a sensitization effect with real data. And just to help reinforce this new information, we want to be able to tell the difference between an effect and a process. So a habituation process does not necessarily lead to habituation. As we saw in this previous slide, there's still a habituation process here, but we're seeing a sensitization effect overall. And the same for a sensitization process doesn't necessarily lead to sensitization. Effects are the observable behaviors. Processes are the mechanisms that underlie that observable behavior. So usually if we're just talking about sensitization or habituation as a behavior, we're talking about effects. And that's why at the very beginning, I didn't necessarily specify that we were looking at a habituation effect. We were just looking at habituation and talking about the behavior. But now that we've introduced processes, we're going to have to be a little bit clearer with which one we're talking about. So if we say habituation effect, or if I say habituation while talking about a behavior, I'm implying an effect. If we're talking about a process, we're usually just going to specify it's a process. And this, the effect that we observe is dependent upon the relative strength of each of the processes at work. So that combination of our sensitization process and the habituation process. And so if we're looking at a habituation effect, we can talk about that as a progressive decrease in the vigor of elicited behavior that may occur with repeated presentations of the eliciting stimulus. So a decrease in behavior when that eliciting stimulus is presented over and over again. The habituation process is a neural mechanism that's activated by the repetitions of that eliciting stimulus, and that neural mechanism is going to reduce the magnitude of responses elicited by that stimulus. So process versus effect. You are absolutely going to need to know the difference between these two. And this difference between effect and process is actually very similar to the difference between performance and learning. So performance being the side that you observe, and the learning being the process that's going on behind the scenes. So a couple of parallels there. And the sensitization effect, same basic idea, but an increase. So I wrote them all out here, but hopefully you get that by now. All right, so where do these processes occur? In the research that proposed these two different processes, Groves and Thompson suggested that both the sensitization and the habituation processes occurred in different parts of the nervous system. So they said that the habituation process happens in the SR system, or the stimulus response system. And this would be the shortest neural pathway that connects the sense organ to the muscle to produce an elicited response. This is basically a reflex arc. So each presentation of an eliciting stimulus is going to activate this SR system and produce that reflex. And by using it multiple times, you can cause a buildup of habituation. And so this system is going to always be activated when the eliciting stimulus is present, and it's going to be stimulus specific. So this is habituation is specific to a particular stimulus. In contrast, the sensitization process happens in our state system. And these are neural structures that determine an organism's general level of responsiveness. So when we talked about sensitization only really happening when you have higher levels of arousal, that's where the link to the state system comes in. So this state system isn't always activated. It's only activated if you already have those higher levels of arousal. And our state system isn't stimulus specific. So sensitization isn't as stimulus specific as habituation is. So in that startle response for rats, having a tone, you can habituate to the tone, but as soon as you hear a buzzer, you'd have the same startle response. It was a stimulus specific habituation. But if you are sensitized, if you have a really bad headache and every time your phone rings, it makes you jump, it's a very bad sound, you hate it, and then your fire alarm goes off, you're also going to hate that. You're also going to jump at that. So you're showing an increase in responsiveness to basically any stimulus because you have that higher level of arousal, because that state system has kind of revved up your responsiveness overall. And so for our usual practical application of these dual processes, we can go back to our checkerboard example and looking at responsiveness to different kinds of stimuli in human infants. And so here, if we're going to focus on this point at the top for our sensitization, we would expect to see an initial activation of our state system, that sensitization, so an increased level of arousal in response to a more intense or visually busy stimulus. And so our data might look something like this in the background, where we have a much higher sensitization process than habituation process, and so we see a net sensitization effect. That's that higher responding to the more complex stimulus. Makes sense. Then we can look at the two red arrows here, which are where we see habituation. So this would be a larger habituation process than a sensitization process, giving us a net habituation effect for both of these. And this would be activating our SR system for the habituation side of things. So this increase here would be the result of our state system, and then we would bring online the SR system for the habituation process. And that's basically how we could look at this here. And if we wanted to look at that startle response in rats, so magnitude of startling versus trials here, we have an original activation of our state system to show that increased responding, so a sensitization effect at the beginning, and then the SR system is active as well down here as we see habituation. So we would expect in this area here that we're seeing more of a habituation process than a sensitization process for a net habituation. And then here we see this interesting inclusion of data where they introduce a light flash. So that's a new kind of eliciting stimulus. And we see a sensitization here because the organism had habituated to the tone that was present. So the SR system got used to the tone, but our activated state system would still respond more intensely to the light flash because it's new and it's something that's if we're already aroused, that would be an increase in behavioral response. And so you can break down what's the ratio of sensitization to habituation processes at each of these different points to figure out or try and explain the net behavior that we're seeing. And one more example here with that difference in background noise. So here with low levels of background noise, we could say that our state system isn't originally activated. So we see habituation using our SR system in this first example. But when that background noise is cranked up, the state system is activated and we see a lot more sensitization here. So the sensitization process would be a lot stronger and we'd see a net sensitization effect on this side here. All right, so we're going to take a little bit of a turn into left field and we're going to talk briefly about songbirds. Now you might have been expecting this because I've warned you that I have done research with songbirds. I know songbirds pretty well. This isn't just because I like songbirds. We're actually going to be looking at an example of a habituation effect in songbirds. So it's just a convenient way to also talk about songbirds. So songbirds are pretty ubiquitous species. They make up almost half of the known species of birds. There are tons of them. And what we think of as songbirds tend to be fairly small, chatty, chirpy little birds, though I always like to point out to people that not everything that is a songbird fits your preconception of what a songbird is. For example, a raven is technically a songbird, which most people don't quite understand, but based on how they're sort of divided up and some of the qualities that ravens have, that family, the Corvidae family, are all songbirds, which is just a fun fact to pull out. And other birds are not songbirds. So a pigeon, not a songbird. Ducks, not songbirds. But if we look at zebra finches or chickadees, or I think that's another kind of finch based on the beak shape, those are songbirds. So why do we care about songbirds? Why do I like them so much? Songbirds are often used as a model for human language development. Songbirds have this very interesting trait where they learn their vocalizations from a model. Basically, a baby songbird needs to hear an adult of its own species produce species-typical vocalizations in order for that baby to itself be able to produce normal vocalizations when they're an adult. So kind of like human babies have to hear their parents or other adults talking and interacting to learn a language, songbirds are the same. They need that exposure to a model to learn species-typical vocalizations. And there are very few identified groups of animals that display this quality. So humans are one. We also see it in dolphins, bats, parrots, songbirds, hummingbirds. This list is growing as time goes on. I think recently we've started to see this in things like seals and elephants. So it might not be quite as rare as what we initially thought, but it's very cool research to follow. But this parallel with how songbirds acquire their vocalizations and how humans acquire language has made songbirds a really great model to study to understand how humans might be learning language. And so songbirds produce both songs and calls, and these vocalizations are all critical to their survival, so there's some evolutionary benefit to having them. So songs tend to be used for territory defense and mating. So songs tend to be related to things that are related to survival and reproduction sort of directly. Calls are a little bit more general use. So they're going to have a variety of different functional roles. They're still biologically relevant. They're just not as directly tied to things like reproductive success. So calls could be involved in coordinating movement within a flock, expressing alarm if a predator enters the area, or telling others of a nearby food source. So in my own research with black-capped chickadees, I focused almost exclusively on their calls because most research ends up actually focusing on songs. Because of this whole direct tie to fitness and reproduction, songs tend to be the focal topic. They tend to be the preferred method of study in songbirds. And in a lot of cases, songs are a lot more likely to have that learned component that people care about when using songbirds as a model, whereas calls tend to be more innate and sort of genetically controlled, but that's not always the case. But that's a tangent for another day. What we're going to look at is an example of stimulus or location specificity in songbirds in nature. And so this is another old paper. Back in 1975, Falls and Brooks decided that they were going to play back songs to territorial males. So here we're specifically looking at white-throated sparrows, though the species doesn't matter a whole lot. What we care about is that males tend to form territories during the breeding season, and they will aggressively defend their territory. And their songs are a way of signaling to other males in the area that this is their territory and that they're defending it. So a fight, quote-unquote fight, between male songbirds might not actually involve a physical confrontation. It might involve a duet where they sing their songs and the better singer defends their territory and the worse singer leaves. And so because of this system that's in place, birds learn very quickly who their neighbors are, and they establish sort of this understanding of which bird would win in a fight, so they don't have to fight with their neighbors. So if you have a territory and you hear a bird singing and you're like, oh, that's just Frank. Frank is over to the east. He has his territory and he knows to stay out of mine. I don't have to worry about Frank. So that individual recognition allows you to identify familiar birds and maybe ignore them or habituate to them because they're not a threat. So you can kind of see where this is going. So for this experiment, they would vary previous experience with songs. So they found songs that were either from a known neighbor, so Frank's songs, or an unknown stranger, new bird Bob, who's coming in from somewhere else. And then they would vary the location of playback. So they would either play back from within the territory boundaries, from at the territory boundaries or within the territory boundaries. So at the edge or already inside. All right, so these graphs are a little bit of a mess here. So let's start by breaking down the first of these graphs. So on this axis, we have number of songs produced per bird. So they're looking at how many vocalizations is the bird of interest, the bird that they're studying, the guy whose territory it is, how many songs are they producing per unit time. At the beginning, they get a baseline. They call it pre-play, which is basically the time before they play back a particular vocalization. So this is their baseline. It's how much singing does this male do when they're by themselves in their territory and there aren't any songs being played. Next, we have the play period. So this is when they would initiate playback. They would get out their tape recorders and hit play and play either a vocalization of a neighboring bird, that's what the N stands for here, or S for a stranger. So during that period, they play one of those two types of songs. And then we would look at the after effect where they're no longer doing playback, but they're seeing what the bird does after they had heard either a neighbor or a stranger in one of two locations. So now we can look at our boundary. So this is at the edge of your territory. This one is labeled as elsewhere, and what it means is not at the boundary, but inside their territory. Okay, so that's getting us oriented to these graphs. So if we're looking at the edge of the territory, right on the boundary, they have this difference in responding. So a stranger, the S birds here, they have a lot more responding after they've heard playback of a stranger, which kind of makes sense. There's a new bird who's in the area. He's not yet in your territory, but he's in the area. And you want to let him know that this is your territory, this is your space, stay out. So the male of interest is going to produce lots and lots of songs per time, and so we see this really high responding. The cool part is that we see a reduced amount of singing when we have playback of known neighbor birds songs. So if they hear it and it's Frank and they know Frank, they don't really care. They have this idea that, well, Frank knows where my territory is. They're not a threat. So reduced responding here. And then what I really like is as soon as they move that playback inside the territory, it doesn't matter if you are a stranger or a known neighbor. If you're in their territory, if you're within their protected area, they're going to aggressively sing back at you no matter what because of the location. So we're seeing a specificity to both the stimuli, whether it's familiar or new, and where it's being played. If it's outside of your territory and you don't care about some of them, or if it's inside your territory and everybody's a threat. So we see this interesting breakdown of specificity, which is so cool. So our bird example shows that changing the nature, or in that case, the location of our eliciting stimulus can produce a recovery of a habituated response. So they returned to high levels of responding to their known neighbors as soon as the location changed, as soon as it was deemed a threat. So changing the nature of that stimulus can reinstate responding that had been previously habituated. We can also reinstate responding by sensitizing the organism. So if you can increase their overall levels of arousal, say as we saw with dishabituation, by showing them a new stimulus that reignites that system, you can see an increase in responding to your original stimulus after introducing a novel stimulus. Within that idea of dishabituation, which we've already covered a couple of times, and we're going to go over it a little bit more once again here, but we can see a special case of sensitization, which is effectively where that secondary stimulus, that mask that you introduced during peekaboo, or the buzzer instead of the tone, that new stimulus is something that has been non-decremented. Basically, you haven't learned to habituate to that yet because it's a novel stimulus. So we see basically like pure sensitization where there hasn't been any habituation in the SR system because it's a new stimulus. It hasn't been habituated at all. So unlike this experiment where we see the example of habituation with low levels of background noise, where if there isn't any kind of arousal state, then we wouldn't necessarily have a very large sensitization process. We would have just the habituation process for our net habituation here. And then the second part of the experiment being that changing the background noise introduces that level of arousal, which activates our sensitization process, which then gets larger than the habituation process that produces our overall sensitization effect. We can start picking stuff apart by showing our trials or our responses to two different stimuli at the same time. So we have these rats who, again, startle response by time, and the solid line being them habituating. Initially, we have that sensitization, but then habituating to a particular tone. And then we see this new stimulus, something that they have never been habituated to before, that flashing light, which causes this initial really strong response here. And then the part we're going to focus on this time that we're talking about this is that for those rats who have been exposed to a secondary stimulus, here they're using a flash of light, we see that their startle response to the tone that they have been habituating to, they see this aggressive response where we see that dishabituation or a resurgence of that startle response. And then they go right back to low levels of responding to the tone after that sort of dishabituation effect. So after that light flash has sort of activated their sensitization process, it very quickly goes back to relaxed sensitization process, and I guess throughout all of this, their habituation process would stay pretty much constant. And that's in comparison to the control group. The solid line continuing across the bottom here is rats who were not exposed to that other stimulus. They were just continuing to be exposed to the tone, and their responding stays fairly well habituated overall. Okay, so that's enough about our dual processes for just a minute here. Let's talk about emotional responses and after effects. Up until this point, the responses, the changes in behavior that we've talked about have been fairly simple things, like a startle response. But stimuli can also evoke complex emotions, things like love, fear, or satisfaction. And when we start looking at these more complex and especially emotional reactions, we can see a couple of qualities. The first is that some of these situations tend to be what's called biphasic. Basically meaning that there are two phases, two opposite phases to them. So the idea is that a particular emotion occurs during the eliciting stimulus, and then the opposite emotion is observed when the stimulus is terminated. So during the eliciting stimulus, we could look at something like drinking. So when you are actively drinking, you might experience all of those sort of depressant type symptoms, more relaxed, calm, mellow, and that's during the stimulus of alcohol. But afterwards, you might experience the opposite emotion once that eliciting stimulus has been terminated. So once you stop drinking, once you go back to normal, then you have a hangover. Maybe you're more irritated. Maybe you're feeling sick and unpleasant. So that's the biphasic aspect there. The textbook, I think, also uses the example of newlyweds, where after getting married, a couple goes on their honeymoon and they feel affection and love and happiness. But after the honeymoon phase, they start feeling the opposite emotion. over time, being exposed to that eliciting stimulus can actually decrease the feeling of that initial emotion because of habituation. So if you drink fairly often, maybe you become habituated to those relaxing effects. So that initial upfront feeling and emotion will decrease. But interestingly, the follow-up, that second phase, you'll start feeling that more intensely. So people who drink for a very long time, they might find that when they're not having a drink, they feel much, much worse. And we'll talk a little bit about the mechanism in that. But that kind of leads us to this idea that our emotional reactions can change with experience, just like our physical responses can. And drug tolerance, and I guess alcohol counts as a drug for this situation, is a fantastic example of that, where we see a decline in the effectiveness of the drug with repeated exposures because you've built up a tolerance or you've habituated to those initial feelings that you get while experiencing that stimulus. And then when you're not taking that stimulus, when you're not exposed to alcohol or whatever drug, you feel much worse feelings. And this brings us into the opponent process theory of motivation, or the OPTM. And so we can kind of put these all together. So for this OPTM, we're going to see that our emotional responses tend to be biphasic. We have an initial reaction that's usually followed up by an opposite after reaction. Our primary reaction will become weaker with repeated stimulations, and that's accompanied by a strengthening of the after effect. So pretty much exactly what I just said. And so this is all related to the homeostatic theory, or the theory of homeostasis, where we can assume that our neural mechanisms that are involved in our emotional behavior are going to follow the general rules of our body, where we're trying to maintain stability or homeostasis. So if we're experiencing very, very positive emotions, to maintain homeostasis, our body will try and compensate and balance out at neutral. And that's where those very strong after reactions of negative emotions could come after primary positive emotions. So those mechanisms that drive this homeostatic balance are very key in this whole process. And this should sound very familiar because you would have covered this in 104 and possibly other classes since. So for our key components here, we have a primary, or A, process. This is going to be our emotional state in the presence of a particular eliciting stimulus. And then we have our opponent, or B, process, the opposite process. So the opposite emotional reaction that's going to be elicited after the A process. So the existence of the A process then causes this B process to occur. And our emotional changes that we observe are going to be a net effect of these two processes, our primary and opponent processes. Now, this should sound really familiar. It's almost exactly the same concept as our dual process theory, where we add our habituation process and our sensitization process to get our net effect. And that's exactly what this opponent process theory is going to be doing. So this OPTM assumes that the emotion arousing stimulus is going to be pushing a person's emotional state away from neutral. That's our primary process. And that primary process, that shift away from neutral, triggers an opponent process that's going to be counteracting the shift, that's going to be acting in the opposite direction to try and bring us back into that homeostatic balance. Now, this is one of those things where I like seeing the diagrams that go with it because the words don't necessarily mean anything at all to me. So let's break down this diagram here. So let's start at the bottom. We're going to be looking at, these are going to have an axis of like intensity on the y-axis and time on the x pretty much exclusively. But we don't really care what the labels are overall. But at the bottom, we're going to be looking at our stimulus event. So when it's down at the bottom, there's no stimulus. When it sort of jumps up like this, we're saying that the stimulus is present. So maybe this is once you've started drinking and now there's alcohol in your system. And then when it goes back down low again, that means that the stimulus is no longer present. And then we want to look at our underlying processes. So our A process, that primary process, is going to start at the onset of our stimulus. So A starts and it's going to cause an increase in some kind of emotional state. So this increase is triggered by the start of this stimulus, and that's going to go up. Then we can see our B process that is going to, it's triggered by this A process, so it starts just a little bit later. You can see there's a flat line here where the B process doesn't kick in right away, but it kicks in later on, and it's going to go in the opposite direction. And you'll notice that the A process ends when the stimulus ends. So our A process starts and ends when the stimulus starts and ends. Our B process is going to be a little bit opposite because it's not run by the stimulus, it's run by the A process, so it has a little bit of a delay here. So it starts after the A process has started, and it's going to end after the A process has ended. And when we add these together, when we get the net product of these two processes, we can see our manifested behavior. So this is the difference between A and B. So at the beginning, you start drinking and you start feeling all of those relaxed feelings from alcohol because the A process is the only thing that's active at the very beginning. Then our B process kicks in to start counteracting the A process, and it brings us back closer to zero. It's not perfect though. And they're going to sort of have an A and B combination in the middle here where both are acting. And then when the stimulus ends, the A goes away, but the B is still present. And because there's no longer an A pushing up, we only have the B pushing down, we see a drop off here in what we're experiencing. So you get a dip in emotion afterwards, and that's where you're feeling worse. Maybe you're feeling very tense and unrelaxed after having been so relaxed from drinking. And then eventually homeostasis returns us to normal. Now this is our initial stimulus exposure, so this is what we'd expect sort of the first time around. But as our bodies learn that we get a specific response to a particular stimulus, our B process ends up changing. So our A process here is the exact same as the initial exposure. You still get the same response from alcohol, but here your body's response is a lot more intense. So it starts right away. There isn't a delay because we've kind of learned that this stimulus is going to cause this rise. So our bodies kind of predict that and start counteracting it much more quickly. And so instead of that, scroll back here, instead of the initial very high feeling that you get at the beginning, once you've been exposed to this particular stimulus multiple times, that initial rise isn't very high. And in fact, we tend to stay pretty close to that net zero and have almost no change, which is our bodies are effectively maintaining homeostasis, which is exactly what the body is trying to do. The bad part comes from afterwards when our A process still ends, when the stimulus ends, but the B process doesn't end as quickly. It still doesn't stop until after the A process has stopped, and it leads to a much larger dip here. And so this dip is what drives a lot of drug addiction. Many people who get addicted to drugs aren't necessarily addicted to the good feeling that they get from taking the drugs. It isn't necessarily that they're trying to get this very, very high feeling at the beginning. What they're trying to do is avoid the low feeling when it wears off. And that low can be very, very intense depending on which kind of responses we're seeing here. So it can be a very strong motivator to try and avoid experiencing this. All right, that was a lot of information for a chapter. So let's quickly refresh what we've covered so far. So environmental stimuli can elicit behavior, and that behavior can be modified by habituation and sensitization. So that's an event alone learning where stimuli from our environment can cause some kind of behavior, and the learning process that we're seeing here is habituation or sensitization to either cause a stronger or weaker response. So if an eliciting stimulus doesn't arouse an organism, or if we don't have a background arousal state, over repeated presentations, we'll get a weaker response. So that's the habituation side of things. If the eliciting stimuli are intense and they arouse an organism, or if the organism has an innate state of arousal, that will lead to stronger responses. It's the sensitization side of things. And when we're looking at the responding to these stimuli, it's going to be representing the net effects of our habituation and sensitization processes. So our effects and our processes are distinct ideas that relate to one another, but you can't use an effect and a process interchangeably. So don't forget that. And in our opponent process, we have mechanisms that keep our initial emotional responses balanced. And again, we have that net effect where we can see our A and B processes sort of working together. And that is chapter 2.